11 days after they drove her out, the canyon was still buried under 4 feet of snow. Wind tore through Copper Ridge like something that had waited all year to do it. The Elkhorn Freight Station had lost 2 supply wagons to drifts on the lower road. 3 families had moved into the trading post to share a single stove. Cattle were dying in the eastern pastures. The man who had signed the order to remove Clara Voss from Elkhorn had not left his office in 6 days. Yet, inside a collapsed mine shaft half a mile up the canyon wall, Clara sat beside a low, steady fire. Columns of charcoal numbers ran across a flat section of sandstone behind her left shoulder. Temperature. Wood. Food. Water. Days. Outside, a pale thread of smoke rose from a crack in the cliff face that no one in Elkhorn knew existed. They had called her a forger. They had expected her to disappear into the cold the way inconvenient things do when winter arrives early. Now the cold was punishing everyone who had believed that. Clara added a dried juniper knot to the coals, watched the flame change color, and made her 11th mark on the wall. The storm was not finished. Neither was she. Rewind 18 days. Back when Clara Voss was still the most trusted woman at Elkhorn Freight Station. She was 23 years old and had arrived in Copper Ridge 2 years earlier after her father's surveying work ended with a broken leg and a bad contract. He had died that autumn from the infection, leaving Clara with a small leather satchel of surveying tools, a working knowledge of land measurement, and a debt to the freight company that employed him. Harlan Oakes, who owned Elkhorn Freight, offered her a settlement. She could work off the debt as a record keeper, supply ledger clerk, and occasional translator for the Spanish-speaking drivers who moved ore through the canyon road. Clara accepted because she had no other option. She stayed because she was genuinely good at it. She kept clean double-entry ledgers. She caught a $20 discrepancy in the salt and flour accounts 3 months after arriving and quietly corrected it. She learned which drivers inflated their mileage claims and which ones actually knew the canyon roads and ice. Harlan was not a warm man, but he was practical, and practical men value accuracy. He gave her a small room above the freight office, full access to the company records, and a stipend that barely covered soap and lamp oil. What Harlan never gave her was a title, a contract of her own, or any public acknowledgement that the books ran smoothly because of her. His nephew, Preston Oakes, had been given a title. Assistant Manager of Operations. Preston was 26, educated in Sacramento, and entirely useless at the actual work of running a freight station. He could not read a topographic survey. He confused the ore manifest with the payroll summary at least twice a month. When he made errors, Clara quietly corrected them before Harlan noticed. Preston knew this. He never thanked her for it. What Preston spent his real energy on was land. Copper Ridge sat at the convergence of 2 canyon routes, which meant that whoever controlled the road access also controlled the freight rates. A territorial land assessor named Virgil Pruitt had been traveling through that autumn to finalize deed records before the new county boundaries took effect. Several properties in the canyon were still held under informal claim rather than properly filed deeds. The first party to file a completed survey and a title transfer fee with Pruitt could establish legal ownership before winter closed the roads. Clara had overheard Preston talking to Harlan about one particular parcel, a narrow strip of canyon land called the Narrows Crossing, where the road pinched between 2 rock faces. Whoever owned that strip could charge tolls on every wagon moving ore out of the territory. It was worth far more than it looked. What Clara did not know was how far Preston was willing to go to make sure Elkhorn got it first. The land deed for Narrows Crossing required a completed survey, a signed transfer document, and the original claim holder's signature. The original claim holder was an elderly widow named Edith Crane, who lived 12 miles south and had held informal rights to the crossing since her husband built a toll shelter there in 1871. She was 61, sharp-minded, and deeply suspicious of freight companies. In the first week of October, someone filed a transfer document with Virgil Pruitt. The signature on the transfer read Edith Crane. Edith Crane had not signed anything. She later told anyone who would listen that she had never met Virgil Pruitt and had received no payment. The deed went to Elkhorn Freight. 2 weeks after the filing, Pruitt made a quiet remark to the land office courier that the signature on the transfer had looked fresh when the ink should have been dry, and that the survey measurements attached to the document were unusually precise for a station that had no licensed surveyor on staff. The courier passed this along to Thomas Aldridge, the territorial land commissioner who happened to be wintering in Copper Ridge on his way to a government survey camp. Aldridge examined the document. He found the measurements precise to a degree that suggested professional training. He asked Harlan, who at Elkhorn had surveying knowledge. Harlan pointed at Clara. Preston was standing behind him when he said it. That same evening, Preston went to the records room. He found the leather satchel of surveying tools Clara had inherited from her father. Among them was a small brass drafting compass and a set of measurement tables in her handwriting, the same handwriting that appeared in the freight ledgers. He removed one page of her measurement tables and folded it into his coat pocket. By morning, the missing page had been placed inside the land deed file in Pruitt's possession. When Aldridge called a formal inquiry, Clara did not cry. She asked why no one had checked the date on the transfer filing, which showed the document submitted 2 days before she had access to Pruitt's office. She asked why the handwriting on the forged signature matched neither her own nor Edith Crane's known letters. She asked why no one had interviewed Edith Crane directly. Harlan looked at the compass in the satchel. He looked at the page from her measurement tables. He chose the easier direction. He called it open and shut. Clara was permitted to keep her winter coat, her father's satchel, one blanket, a tin of hardtack biscuits, and the clothes on her back. Harlan also made it understood that the debt her father had owed fully 2 years of her labor was still outstanding. She no longer worked at Elkhorn Freight, but she still owed Elkhorn Freight. Thomas Aldridge sat quietly at the back of the room and said nothing. He was a careful man who did not like to act on incomplete information. He told himself he would investigate further once the roads cleared. Magistrate Roy Cutter, who served the territory out of a converted assay office, watched the proceeding from a wooden chair in the corner. He had known Harlan Oakes for 11 years and owed him 3 favors he preferred not to name publicly. Clara met Cutter's eyes across the room. He looked at the window instead. Ruth Aldine, the freight station cook and a former school teacher from Missouri, stepped forward with a jar of dried venison. Harlan shook his head once. Ruth set the jar back down on the shelf. But when Clara passed the doorway, Ruth pressed something into her coat pocket without anyone seeing. A folded piece of oilcloth and a small tin of sulfur matches. Ruth said nothing. She did not have to. By noon, Clara walked out of Elkhorn Freight Station alone into a wind that smelled of incoming snow. The lower canyon road south was the obvious route to Ridgemont, the nearest settlement with a sheriff's jurisdiction. Clara started in that direction and abandoned it within 90 minutes. The road crossed 3 open meadows where wind moved at killing speeds. Ice already covered the creek crossings. Her boots were not built for this. The cold was not abstract. It was immediate and methodical, working through her collar, her cuffs, the gap between her scarf and her hat. The hardtack biscuits were already stiff in the tin. She climbed instead. Not because she had a plan, because the canyon wall offered windbreaks and the valley floor offered none. She moved the way she had once watched her father move through unmapped ground, deliberately, preserving energy, reading the terrain rather than fighting it. She tested unstable slopes before committing weight. She kept trees between herself and the open sky whenever possible. She drank from trickles of water running over sheltered rock faces rather than stopping to dig through ice at stream edges. She tucked the blanket beneath her outer coat and kept both hands moving even when she did not need them. The surveying tools in the satchel were heavy. She considered leaving them. She didn't. They had been her father's, and beyond sentiment, a brass compass and a set of measurement tools were worth more than most things she owned. 2 hours into the climb, a ledge of shale gave way beneath her right boot. She went down hard on one knee. The satchel skidded 3 feet down the slope before she caught the strap. She knelt in the snow for a moment, with her eyes closed, feeling the pain move from her knee upward. Then she checked the compass. Still intact. She stood up. The sound reached her before she could see its source. Low, sustained, percussive. Water falling against stone, filtered through rock and distance. She turned toward it. Morrow Falls was not famous. It appeared on no official survey map that Clara had ever processed. It dropped approximately 35 feet from a limestone overhang into a narrow basin that had been cut over centuries into the canyon wall. In summer, it was probably beautiful. In early winter, it was encased in ice on 3 sides, and the falls themselves had narrowed to a dark rope of water still moving through a tunnel of frozen spray. What Clara noticed was the gap. On the western edge of the falls, where the limestone overhang jutted furthest from the cliff face, the ice did not seal completely against the rock. A dark space existed behind the falling water, roughly 6 feet wide at its widest point. Wind currents were wrong for a simple pocket of air. Something was pulling the draft inward. Getting there required crossing 17 feet of ice-slicked limestone shelf with the cliff on one side and the basin on the other. Clara used the satchel strap wound around her forearm as a counterweight. She moved 6 inches at a time. She fell once, caught herself on both palms, and kept moving. Behind the falls, she found the opening. It was 4 feet high and barely 20 inches across, cut into the rock at an angle that made it nearly invisible from any approach. Cold air moved outward from it, carrying a scent she knew immediately: dry dust, old char, and something that might have been cured hide. The smell of a place that had been used and then left. Clara lay flat in the wet rock and pushed the satchel through ahead of her. The passage ran about 25 feet before widening. After the first few feet, the floor became dry sandstone. The sound of the falls dropped to a low vibration. She felt more in her chest than her ears. When the passage opened fully, Clara could not see the dimensions of the space around her. She could feel that it was larger than a crawl space and smaller than a barn. She found the sulfur matches in her pocket. The first 2 failed. The third caught. In the brief flare of light, she saw enough. A fire ring of flat stones near the center. A low shelf carved into the eastern wall. Objects on that shelf she could not yet identify. A ceiling that rose to what appeared to be 8 or 9 feet at the apex. A floor that sloped slightly toward a lower depression in the southwestern corner. The match burned her thumb. The darkness returned, but the cold, for the first time since walking out of Elkhorn, did not follow her inside. The fire ring held ash that crumbled to nothing when she touched it. Old. Below the shelf, beneath a flat capstone, she found a shallow wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. The oilcloth had kept out most of the moisture. Inside the box, a tin tinderbox with dry char cloth still inside, a coil of tarred cord, a rusted but functional folding knife, 4 candles sealed in wax paper, a small glass bottle of rendered fat, and a folded paper printed in Spanish that turned out to be a miner's equipment list from approximately 1874. On the shelf above, 3 clay vessels, 2 sealed with wax and 1 open and empty. A bundle of dried grass and bark, a coil of wire, a section of canvas folded into a tight square, several river stones in varying sizes, a tin plate, 2 tin cups, nested, and a thin, leather-bound journal with a broken clasp, its pages swollen but mostly legible, the field notes of a prospector named Aurelio Serna, who had used this chamber as a winter camp during the seasons of 1876 and 1877. Clara unsealed the smaller clay vessel first. Dried corn and pinyon nuts, the top layer stale but the interior still dry. The second vessel held strips of jerked elk, desiccated and hard as wood but uncontaminated. Combined with the hardtack from her tin, she had perhaps 8 to 10 days of cautious rationing if she was careful. She built a fire from the dried grass and 1 candle end, then fed it slowly with bark strips until she had a flame worth trusting. She set 2 of the river stones beside the coals to heat. Then she found a piece of charcoal in the fire ring and made her first mark on the wall. Day 1. Fire. Shelter. Supplies assessed. For the first time in 2 years, the numbers on a wall belonged to her own survival, not to Harlan Oaks. The first problem arrived the following morning. Clara built the fire larger, wanting to warm the chamber properly before examining the shelf contents in full light. Within 20 minutes, smoke spread across the ceiling and dropped. The chamber filled. Her eyes burned. She smothered the fire with her boot heel and crawled toward the passage, pressing her face close to the cold air from outside. She knew what had happened. Not enough draft to carry combustion products upward and out. The fire ring was functional. The ventilation was not. She went back to Cerna's journal. His Spanish was 1870s Sonoran, different from the borderland dialect she had picked up from the Elkhorn drivers, but she could follow enough. He described the same problem in his second winter entry. His solution was written in the margin in smaller script, as if added after the fact. La chimenea, natural buscar arriba. Detrás de la repisa norte, the natural chimney search above, behind the north shelf. Behind the north shelf. Clara found a passage she had missed entirely in the dark. It angled upward, at about 30 degrees, and narrowed to a crack she could barely get her arm into. She used the folding knife handle to probe upward. Compacted earth, root tendrils, dead leaves. She worked for the better part of an hour with the knife handle and a length of wire, clearing the obstruction in stages. Her arm ached from the awkward angle. She lost feeling in her fingers twice and stopped to warm them against the heated stones before continuing. When she lit the candle beside the fire ring and watched the flame, it trembled, then drew upward in a slow but unmistakable column. She built the fire again. This time she started small bark, then cord, then one split piece of the dry wood she had found, stacked beneath the shelf. The smoke rose. She waited. It kept rising. Clara sat back on her heels beside a working fire in a dry stone chamber, while a blizzard built pressure against the canyon outside. The shelter had been broken. She had found the break and fixed it. These were not the same thing as luck, she wrote on the wall. Day 2. Vent cleared. Draft holds. Fire safe. Over the next 6 days, Clara rebuilt what Aurelio Cerna had left her the way she had once rebuilt broken freight ledgers systematically, without sentiment, working from what existed toward what was needed. The canvas section became a sleeping enclosure when she lashed it between 2 iron spikes she found at the base of the north shelf and draped it over a frame of wire and cord. She discovered that a single layer of canvas lost heat quickly against the stone floor. She raised the sleeping surface on a platform of flat rocks and placed 2 heated river stones beneath the canvas before lying down. The temperature inside the enclosure on the 4th night, measured against the glass thermometer she found wrapped in cloth inside Cerna's wooden box, was 47 degrees. Outside, by the way ice formed on the rocks within 20 minutes of the fire dying, it was well below 10. She organized the fuel. Cerna's journal mentioned a deadfall stand of pinyon pine approximately a quarter-mile northeast along a ridge route he called the Upper Trace. Clara found it on the 3rd morning. The wood was old and dry, and she could carry enough in one trip to last 2 days if she burned carefully. She did not burn carelessly. She had learned rationing from 4 years of freight ledgers. She repaired the east shelf support with a length of wire and 2 flat stones wedged as anchors. She moved all food containers to the highest shelf. She dug a shallow drainage channel in the southwest corner to redirect the meltwater that crept in through the floor during midday warming. She set snares in the willow brush below the ridge using the tarred cord and a figure 4 trigger she had once seen a Mexican teamster demonstrate in the freight yard. The first 2 attempts caught nothing. She moved them to narrow game corridors between willow stands where animal tracks concentrated. On the 5th morning, a snowshoe hare waited in the 2nd snare. She killed it quickly and cleanly. She used every part of it meat for food. Sinew added to her cord supply. The small pelt stretched over wire to dry. The bones set aside near the fire. Nothing wasted. Nothing could be. Meanwhile, back at Elkhorn Freight Station, the lie was becoming inconvenient. Thomas Aldridge was a methodical man, and the longer the storm kept him in Copper Ridge, the more methodical he became. He spent 3 days re-examining the land transfer document. He sent a rider to Ridgemont with a written request for Edith Crane's signature on file, with the territorial post office, any letter she had written in the past 2 years. The rider returned in 48 hours with 2 examples. Edith Crane formed her capital E with 3 horizontal bars of equal length. The signature on the transfer document used a capital E with a long top bar and a short bottom bar. It was not a large difference. It was the kind of difference that only mattered if you were the kind of person who looked. Aldridge also asked Ruth Aldine, quietly, over a cup of bitter coffee in the freight kitchen, whether Clara Voss had ever had access to Virgil Pruitt's filing cabinet. Ruth said Clara had not been in the land assessor's room once in 2 weeks, because Clara had been sick with a head cold for the first week of Pruitt's stay, and Aldridge could verify this with Dr. Emmett Price, who had prescribed her a steam treatment 3 separate times. Aldridge wrote that down. Preston Oakes had been watching Aldridge watch the documents. He told Harlan that the commissioner was looking too carefully and that something needed to be done before the roads opened. Harlan told Preston that something had been done, Clara was gone, and that Preston should stop talking about it in the main office where drivers could hear. Preston started talking about Clara being seen near the canyon wall. He mentioned it to the liveryman. He mentioned it to the teamsters eating supper in the freight hall. He said it the way people say things they want others to repeat casually, just often enough. She was probably dead in a snowdrift somewhere. Someone should check before she found her way back with false stories. Emmett Price, who had in fact treated Clara's head cold in October and had always found her to be precise and honest to a fault, listened to Preston repeat this in the freight hall one evening. He did not say anything at the table. He went home and told his wife. His wife told Ruth Aldine's sister-in-law. Ruth had kept Clara's share of the weekly bread ration on a shelf in the kitchen since the day of the expulsion, wrapped in cloth, replaced every 3 days. She kept doing it even now. The old prospector Vic Sandoval, who ran a one-man assay shed at the north edge of the canyon, had gone up the wall trail to check his claim stakes after the first storm broke and reported seeing smoke rising from the cliff face below Morrow Falls. Nobody in the freight station had business above the valley floor. Harlan said it was steam from a hot spring. Preston said it too quickly. He said Clara could not possibly have survived up there and that no one should go looking before the ice made the cliff trail safe. Thomas Aldridge noticed that Preston had not been asked whether Clara could have survived. He wrote that down also. Aldridge said nothing publicly. But 3 days later, he went to Vic Sandoval's assay shed and asked to borrow a pair of ice cleats. Clara saw him coming from a ledge above the falls. She had gone up there every second morning to read the weather and watch the valley. She recognized him by his coat, a military-cut wool duster she had logged into the freight arrivals register when he checked in 6 weeks earlier. She was still for a long time. Then she came down. Aldridge crossed the last stretch of ice shelf cautiously, stopped at the gap behind the falls, and looked at what he could see of the passage. He did not enter. He called her name once, not loudly. Clara stepped out from behind an ice formation 10 yards to his left. She had the folding knife on her belt, but her hands were at her sides. She looked different than she had in the freight office. She looked like someone who had been making decisions for 11 days without anyone's permission. Aldridge looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the thin thread of clean smoke rising from the cliff. He asked if she would be willing to write down, in precise and dated order, every step of the filing process she had witnessed during Pruitt's stay at Elkhorn, which rooms she had entered, which documents she had touched, and when. Clara said she already had. She had been writing it in the back pages of Cerna's journal for the past 4 days. Every detail she could recall, in the order it occurred, with the specific dates she had recorded in the freight ledgers, which she had also partially memorized because she had entered them herself. Aldridge looked at the journal she produced from her coat. Then he looked at the compass in the open satchel. He asked whether the survey measurements in the transfer document matched the standard precision of her father's instruments. Clara told him they did not. Her father's survey method used a specific baseline triangulation that produced results to the nearest quarter chain. The measurements in the transfer document were calculated to the nearest eighth chain, a different method entirely, one she had never used and could demonstrate if he needed her to. Aldridge put the journal inside his coat. Before leaving, he looked at her carefully. He was carrying 2 pounds of pemmican wrapped in paper, which he set on the flat rock near the passage entrance. He said nothing about it. He turned and started back down the cliff face. Clara waited until he had cleared the ice shelf. Then she said, without raising her voice much, that there was one more thing. Aldridge stopped. She told him to look at the freight ledger from October 14th. Preston Oakes had signed out a transit instrument from the station's equipment room. On that date, an instrument only used for land measurement. She had logged it herself. The instrument had been returned on October 17th, the same day the transfer document was filed with Pruitt. Aldridge did not write that down. He stood still for a long moment. Then he nodded once and kept walking. The real storm arrived 4 days later. It did not build slowly. It came over the ridge in the dark, and by morning the valley was gone beneath it. Wind drove horizontally across the cliff face. Ice formed on the passage entrance in sheets. The lower trace route that Aldridge had used disappeared under 4 feet of drift in less than 6 hours. Inside the chamber, Clara followed her routine, with the precision of someone who understood that routine was the only thing standing between function and failure. Every 3 hours, she checked the upper vent with a wire probe and cleared any ice formation before it could block the draft. She rebuilt the sleeping enclosure with an additional layer of canvas after the outer layer showed condensation. She moved the food stores 1 shelf higher when meltwater crept upward from the floor. She rationed 2 small meals, no more, regardless of how cold made her want to eat for warmth. She burned 1 measured bundle of wood each night, no more, and maintained the day's heat primarily through the Riverstone system under her bedding. On the second night of the blizzard, the draft faltered. She recognized it immediately by the way the fire lay flat instead of drawing upward. She climbed to the vent passage with a candle and found a new ice blockage 3 feet higher than the previous one. She worked in complete darkness with numb hands and a wire probe for 40 minutes before the draft returned. She came back down to the fire ring and sat with both palms against a warm stone until the feeling returned to her fingers. She wrote on the wall, Day 14. Draft blocked and cleared. Storm continues. System holds. On the 4th day, a sound came from the lower passage that was not wind and not ice. Clara pressed herself against the wall near the fire ring. The knife was in her hand. The candle was on the shelf. She waited without moving. The sound was wrong for the canyon. Too rhythmic, too deliberate. A voice said her name. It was Ruth Aldine. She came through the passage on her hands and knees, dressed in 2 coats and a man's wool trousers, dragging a canvas pack behind her. Her face was white from cold and she was breathing in the careful, controlled way of someone who had pushed past the point where careful was easy. Clara pulled her inside. She wrapped her in the dry hides from the sleeping enclosure and gave her warm water in small sips from a heated tin cup. She kept Ruth away from the fire at first. Rapid rewarming was its own kind of dangerous, and watched her color return in gradual stages. Ruth could not speak fully for the first hour. When she could, she said 4 things. Thomas Aldridge had found the transit instrument entry in the October ledger. The instrument bore a set of engraved initials, P.O. Preston Oaks had missed this detail when he had signed it out, or had not considered that Clara would remember logging it. Edith Crane had come to Copper Ridge on horseback 4 days before the blizzard, covered in 40 miles of mud, and had signed a sworn affidavit stating she had never transferred her claim and had never met Virgil Pruitt in her life. Roy Cutter had received a letter from the Territorial Governor's Land Office, asking him to explain how a contested deed had been finalized without a licensed survey and without witness signatures, per the 1,882 land ordinance, and Harlan Oaks had told Preston to leave Copper Ridge before the storm closed the southern road. Preston had left. He had not taken enough supplies for the weather that followed. Ruth had come because the bread ration was on the shelf in the kitchen, and she had replaced it 14 times, and she was finished doing it for a shelf. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she went to the east wall and took the dried venison Ruth had pressed into her coat pocket the day she left. She had rationed it across 11 days. 3 strips remained. She put 2 in front of Ruth and kept 1. Ruth looked at the charcoal wall. She read the entries carefully from the first mark to the most recent. After a long time, she said that she had taught school for 6 years in Missouri, and she had never seen a student keep a record that was this consistent. Clara said that her father had taught her to record what she did, not how she felt, because feelings changed, but measurements didn't. Ruth said nothing for a while. Then she said that Preston had been found by a cavalry dispatch rider on the Ridgemont Road, 6 miles south in a snowdrift, alive but badly frostbitten in both hands. The dispatch rider had brought him back to Copper Ridge. He had been in Dr. Price's care for 2 days. Clara asked if he was going to lose the hands. Ruth said probably not both of them. Clara was quiet. Then she took the last strip of dried venison and cut it in half. She kept 1 piece and wrapped the other in a scrap of canvas. She told Ruth to give Preston the 2nd piece when he was well enough to eat it. Not from kindness, she said. because she was not interested in having anyone say she had let a man suffer when she could have helped. Ruth looked at her. She took the canvas-wrapped piece and put it in her coat pocket without a word. The storm broke on the 15th day. 3 days later, when the lower trace had been broken by riders from Ridgemont, Thomas Aldridge made the climb to Morrow Falls with Magistrate Roy Cutter, Vic Sandoval, and Emmett Price. Aldridge carried the Territorial Land Commissioner's seal. Cutter carried a written order from the Governor's Land Office. Sandoval carried a rope in case anyone slipped on the ice shelf. Price carried his medical bag out of professional habit. They entered through the passage one at a time. Clara was not standing at attention. She was at the north shelf sorting the remaining food stores and entering the final tally into the back pages of Cerna's journal. She looked up when they came in, acknowledged Aldridge with a nod, and continued what she was doing until she had finished the entry. Then she set the journal on the shelf and turned to face them. Cutter read the order. The land transfer for Narrows Crossing was voided pending criminal inquiry. Clara's expulsion from Elkhorn Freight was overturned on the grounds of manufactured evidence. The debt record Harlan had attached to her name was suspended, pending a review of all freight ledgers going back 30 months. Harlan Oakes had come partway up the cliff trail and stopped. He stood at the bottom of the passage entrance and did not come inside. It may have been that the passage was too narrow for a man of his width and pride to enter without bending significantly. Aldridge told him what was required could be said from inside. After a moment, Harlan ducked under the overhang and came through the passage on one knee. Inside the chamber, he had to bend at the shoulders to avoid the ceiling at the north end where it dropped to 6 feet. He moved toward the center where the ceiling was higher and stood in the firelight looking at the woman he had sent into a blizzard with a tin of hardtack and someone else's debt. Clara let him look for a moment. Then she said there were 3 things he had not checked. The instrument log for October 14th. Edith Crane's signature against any letter on file. And the transfer documents, measurement precision, against the method used by her father's survey equipment. She said it without raising her voice. She was not performing anything for the men standing behind her. She was simply stating facts in the order they mattered. Harlan had no answer. He looked at the charcoal wall. He looked at the sleeping enclosure, the organized wood bundles, the stored food, the hanging pelt, the drainage channel in the corner. He had sent her out here to disappear. She had built something instead. He turned and walked back toward the passage. At the entrance, the ceiling dropped to 4 feet. Harlan Oakes, who owned Elkhorn Freight Station and had once held the authority to decide whether Clara Voss belonged there, bent himself nearly in half to pass through the opening she had made her front door. Then he was gone into the daylight. No one said anything for a moment. Aldridge looked at the charcoal wall. He was quiet long enough that the others began moving toward the exit. Before he followed them, Aldridge turned back to Clara and asked whether she was willing to return to the freight station. Clara said she was not. She had already filed a survey claim on the chamber site and the ridge access route using the proper measurement method documented, dated, and witnessed by Vic Sandoval 3 days before the storm arrived. She pointed to Sandoval without looking at him. He raised one hand slightly. Aldridge looked from Sandoval to Clara to the journal on the north shelf. He said he would need a copy of the survey for the land office record. Clara said she had already made one. She produced a second set of pages from the satchel, clean, precise, completed to the nearest quarter chain. She held them out. Aldridge took them. He looked at the measurements for a moment, then looked at her. He said that, for the record, the measurements appeared to be correct. Clara said she was aware. Clara Voss did not return to Elkhorn Freight Station. She built a small structure on the ridge above Morrow Falls that winter, using timber Vic Sandoval helped her cut and haul in exchange for a survey of his claim boundaries, which she completed in 4 days and which turned out to be 50 feet more favorable to him than he had believed. The chamber behind the falls remained part of her life. She used it as a cold season record room, a storm shelter for travelers who came through the canyon, and a teaching space of sorts. Emmett Price sent 2 young men up in the spring to learn the heated stone warming method after he saw that Clara had kept a man alive through the blizzard using less wood and better technique than any method he had previously known. Edith Crane came up in April, driving her own wagon. She brought a smoked ham, a bolt of good wool, and 2 clay storage vessels she had fired herself. Clara gave her a complete copy of the survey that established the correct Narrows crossing boundary, the one that put the crossing back in Crane's name where it had always belonged. Ruth Aldine's bread ration shelf in the Elkhorn kitchen was empty for the first time in 3 months. Ruth told people she had finally found the right recipient for it. Thomas Aldridge wrote a formal report to the governor's land office. It contained a section on the documentation practices at Elkhorn Freight that resulted in a territorial audit. The audit produced findings about overcharged freight rates, manipulated weight records, and missing wages that took most of 2 years to fully resolve. The first ledger it referenced was one Clara had quietly corrected in her second month at the station. Preston Oakes stood trial in Ridgemont the following April. He lost the first 3 fingers of his left hand to frostbite. He lost his freedom for 14 months to the conviction. He lost the case entirely because of an engraved transit instrument and a date in a freight ledger entered in a steady, careful hand. Harlan Oakes lost the freight contracts he needed most when the ore companies learned what the territorial audit had found. The Canyon Road was eventually designated a public route, which made the Narrows crossing deed irrelevant for the purpose Preston had stolen it to serve. Spring came to Copper Ridge the way it always did, slowly, then entirely at once. In the chamber behind Morrow Falls, the charcoal entries remained on the sandstone wall through the winter and into the thaw. Clara had not written over them or washed them away. Visitors who came through that summer sometimes paused at the wall and tried to read the columns. Day 11. Outside, 11 below. Enclosure, 49. 1 bundle. Draft holds. Stores dry. The marks did not record how she had felt on that night. They recorded what she had done. That was why they were still there when the season changed, when the men who had sent her into the cold had already begun their separate diminishments. When the canyon outside looked nothing like it had on the morning, she had pressed herself flat against the wet limestone and pushed through an opening no one else had thought to find. The numbers lasted because they were true. The truth, as it turned out, was more durable than anything Harlan Oakes had ever tried to bury beneath it. When the truth feels too small to fight with, remember that Clara never raised her voice. She simply kept recording what was real. Precision outlasted power. Quiet consistency dismantled what cruelty had carefully constructed. Whatever you are holding right now that feels impossible to prove, keep your records clean, keep your hands steady, and trust that careful work leaves marks that last far longer than any accusation made against you. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you an entertaining journey while leaving behind a lesson worth carrying with you.